Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. We're so happy that you're with us today. We'll give everybody a few minutes to log in and get settled. And as they're doing that, we're going to keep an eye on the waiting room, see if there are more people that have to be admitted, and we will start shortly. Thank you for joining us today. Jessie's here. She's very excited, and we're happy to have her with us today. So thank you. Thank you. Again, we usually wait till about 12:01 just to make sure that everybody is settled. Everybody has their headphones in. If you have not done so already, please rename your screen name with your name and class year if applicable, or the organization that you're joining us from would be great. That way, if you have a question or anything during the presentation, we can call on you. And again, we're so happy that you could join us. Oh, Sister Karen says that they have a few people in the Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion watching. So thanks, Sister Karen. Way to rally the troops. Okay, we will get started. Let's see. Close. Well, good afternoon again, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ellen Still, and I am Emmanuel's Director of Alumni Engagement. Also joining on the call today is my colleague, Alexis Scrima. She's our Alumni Relations Coordinator and Emmanuel College Class of 2021. If you've not done so already, please add your name and class year on the screen. If you're not an Emmanuel alum, please note your school or company that you're with. Thank you. After Jessie's presentation, we will have a casual and open discussion and encourage everyone to take turns adding to that discussion. Please bear with us as we get into a rhythm, and please remain on mute unless you are speaking. Questions can be submitted through the chat or Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen throughout the talk. Also, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like as well. We tend to be a little informal with these, especially during our discussion portion at the end. So we are so excited to present the third installment of our 2023 Emmanuel College Alumni Spotlight Series. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Jessie Wang. Jessie currently serves as the Assistant Dean of Equity, Inclusion, and Student Success at East Tennessee's State Universities. Okay, let me try that again. She currently serves as the Assistant Dean of Equity, Inclusion, and Student Success at East Tennessee State University's Clemmer College. Wang holds a bachelor's degree in counseling psychology from Emmanuel College, where she was also elected as president of the Student Government Association. Directly following her bachelor's degree, Wang earned her master's degree in higher education administration from Harvard University. While at Harvard, Wang's research centered on fostering historically underrepresented student success at predominantly white institutions of higher education, focusing primarily on students of color and first-generation students. As an assistant dean, Wang has direct oversight of the Office of Student Success, academic advisement, recruitment, retention, and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives for the college. As an active member of the community through the Chamber of Commerce, Wang serves as a council member for the Young Professionals of Johnson City's organization as a representative for the Move to Johnson City campaign, and as a board member for the Bob Owens Community Leadership Fund, which focuses on improving mental health conditions in the region. She also serves as a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Alliance of Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. Wang was recently named as one of 29 professionals throughout the state of Tennessee for Leadership Tennessee Next, a competitive statewide leadership program that addresses issues of the state. Wang has led over a dozen presentations and trainings surrounding topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout Northeast Tennessee and at various colleges and universities throughout the United States. Still active at her alma mater, Wang served for 2 years as a director at large for the Emmanuel College Alumni Association Board and returns to Harvard annually to guest lecture for a class entitled Redesigning Colleges and Universities for Equitable Student Success. Welcome, Jessie. We are so happy that you're here today.
Ellen, when you said some of your bio, I didn't know you would have to read it. I apologize. I would have been a much abridged version.
My pleasure. No, everything on there is well earned and should be noted. So thank you.
Thank you.
Didn't
And
mean
it's
to embarrass you. Thank you,
no.
Jessie.
It's so great to be here with you all today, and I'm so excited to see all of you virtually. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here. And I guess, Ellen, should I go ahead and just dive right in? Awesome. Okay, so let me share my screen. And so today we're going to be talking about fostering inclusive classrooms and equitable student success. And so this presentation really focuses predominantly on higher education, but there are also ways that we can adapt it to include secondary education too, which I will definitely make sure to do. Just so I can get a sense of who's in the room, if you do work in higher education, will you raise your hand or do the little hand emoji just so I can get a sense of who? Okay, so we have a few different people in higher education, a lot of people in higher education. Anybody in secondary education, so kindergarten through 12th grade, I want to make sure if there are that I talk a little bit about that too. Any kindergarten through 12th? Okay, so we'll focus mostly on higher education, a little bit of secondary education too. But thank you again so much for being here. My name's Jessie Wang. Throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat box. I will try to be watching it. And Ellen, please feel free, and Alexis, to interrupt me at any time if there's a question that I'm missing too. So we'll start off with the basics. What is equitable student success? So the way that equitable student success can easily be defined is as improving the success rate, so degree attainment, getting students to that graduation stage, and eliminating gaps that may exist based on race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender identity, disability, and other identity-based factors. So what's the importance of equitable student success? Why do we have these conversations? Well, I actually thought to do this, we could look at Emmanuel College. And so I pulled some statistics from the National Center for Education Statistics. And so this is Emmanuel College's overall graduation rate. And this is just going to help ground us in this conversation. So we actually see that Emmanuel College has a really good graduation rate. 70% is actually higher than the national average of graduation rates for private nonprofit colleges and universities. So the national average is 68%. Emmanuel College is above that, meaning 70% of students who start at Emmanuel College get across that graduation stage. Where do we lose students? It's often that they might transfer to a different college or university. They may decide college isn't for them. They may encounter financial hurdles. There's a whole bunch of different things, and that's part of what we'll talk about today too. So then if we look more carefully though, let's not just think about the graduation rate, let's break it down by gender. And this is actually impressive as well. So Emmanuel College graduates male identifying and female identifying students at the same rate. And this is often not the case. So right now in higher ed, what we're seeing is a trend of male identifying students graduating at much lower rates than female identifying students. And so Emmanuel College is actually doing really well in this too. So we see that it's equitable across the board here. Where we get more into it is looking at the graduation rates by race and ethnicity. So at Emmanuel College, 74% of white identifying students graduate within 6 years. And 6 years is the metric that we really look at these statistics through. So I know oftentimes we think of college as a 4-year affair, but we know that for some students, graduating within 6 years, that is at least, it gets them out of college, on their way to a career pathway. And many times this is the number of years that we look at. So we have 74% of white students graduating. 69% of Hispanic Latinx students are graduating. So that is also actually fairly high. It's a little bit lower than white students, but not a huge gap. It's something that if the gap continued to grow, would be something we would look at, but we're talking about 5% less than white counterparts. Where we really need to be paying attention is when we see that we then get to 53%, right, of Asian students. So Asian students at Emmanuel College are graduating at a 21% lower rate than their white counterparts. And more than that, Black students are graduating at the lowest rate at 50%. And so Black students at Emmanuel College are graduating at 24% less rate than their white counterparts. Now, this is this is the trend in higher education, right? I'm having these conversations. I'm in East Tennessee and I'm having these conversations, and our conversations on our side are a lot more dire. And so I'll say transparently that at East Tennessee State University, where I work, Black students graduate at a 27% rate. And what that means is that 73% of Black students here are not graduating. They are not getting across that graduation stage. How do we tell someone there's a 73% chance you're not going to graduate? Right? And so just to put that into perspective, Emmanuel College is in a much different place, but there are still areas that we can work on. So if it's 50%, we're still saying that there's a 50% chance for Black and African American students that you'll graduate, a 50% chance that you might not. And so what can we do for these different populations to make sure that we create equity in how we're graduating? We want to see Black and African American students, Asian students, and Hispanic and Latinx students graduating at the same rate as their white counterparts. They're getting up towards that 70% kind of area. So how do we do this? Part of it is looking also at Boston and comparing that to Emmanuel College. So Emmanuel College recruits from all over the United States, but I know that mainly students come from New England areas. And so I did not have the time to pull all of the statistics for the different New England areas that I know that Emmanuel College really recruits from. But let's just look at Boston, because that's where Emmanuel College is housed. What we see and what we can compare is what our demographics are within Emmanuel College. And these are our 2022 demographics to Boston's demographics. And these demographics from Boston came from the 2021 census. So what we see is, for the most part, they're pretty similar, but there are some major differences. And the most major is that in Boston, 23.5% of the population identifies as Black or African American, and at Emmanuel College, only 6.5% of our population identifies as Black or African American. So that would be the biggest gap that we see. What that tells us is we're not reaching a certain population, and why this can stem into this issue, and I'll talk about this later more, is that representation plays a huge role in helping students figure out a sense of belonging, find that sense of belonging on a campus, see people who look like them who are also successful, and it also affects recruitment too. And so this is part of the conversation that I wanted to kind of ground us with some of these statistics. So when we look at enrollment, when I look at enrollment, this is the easiest way I can do it. People make fun of me here because I'm a big acronym girl. I'm a big, let's just think of things that are easy to understand and look pretty too. And so when I look at enrollment, I look at it through this lens of it's a 6 A's. And so if we think about it, the first is access. How do students find out information about Emmanuel College? How do they even know Emmanuel College exists and is a college for them? Once we get through access, how do we make sure students are applying? So now they know it's out there. How do we make sure they submit that application and decide, I want to apply to go to Emmanuel College? After that, we go into admit, accept. And so this is the idea that students have now applied. If they've been accepted into Emmanuel College, so our admissions team has said, you're accepted, how do we make sure they actually say, okay, I'm going to attend? How do they choose? How do we make sure they choose Emmanuel College? Then from here, we think once a student has said, I'm going to come to Emmanuel, this is perfect. This is our new incoming class. We have these numbers. But what we see actually is between the time period of students saying, I'm going to come, and actually showing up on that first day of class, we typically lose students in higher ed. And this is the phenomenon called summer melt. And basically, it's the idea that students don't meet one of the things they have to do over summer. So whether that's attending orientation, whether that's immunizations, anything like that, they're not doing that. And so they're not actually showing up. So that moves us to the next A. Attend is, how do we make sure students are physically present on campus on that first day of classes? And how do we make sure that after that, they continue to come to classes and they continue to be present? Achieve, this is basically the only A word I could come up with that would be the same as retention, right? So how are we making sure that they get to that graduation stage? How are we making sure they are successful, that they graduate knowing that there are career options open to them, that Emmanuel College has really, helped them come into a professional workplace where now they feel like they can be successful for the rest of their life, whether that's going into a career field or going into graduate school. but they're getting across that graduation stage and they feel like they're set up for success. And then the last one is alumni. And alumni is this idea of let's make sure that even once our students graduate, we are still engaging with them. We are still present with them. We're still a part of their lives. And the importance of this is that this 6 A's is one big circle of life, because our alumni then go on to impact access. How that is our alumni are the people who really also recruit students too by word of mouth. And so here, actually, I'm in East Tennessee in a very small town called Johnson City. And I went to speak to a high school classroom recently that is actually part of East Tennessee State University, has a K-12 school on its campus. And I went to speak to one of the senior classes, and I talked about basically the college going process. So, what's like to fill out that application. A lot of our students here are first generation students who are talking about that. And I also talked about how when I was a student in high school, I was in Miami, and I knew I really wanted to go to Boston. When you're thinking about schools, don't just think about the ones you always hear of, like BU and Boston College. Like, think of also, let's do some research to figure out what else is out there. And I talked about finding Emmanuel College and how great of a fit that was for me. The community that I found there, the experience that I had. And I actually was literally last week having lunch with a friend outside, and one of the students who was in that class, I actually didn't recognize her, but her mom came over to me and said, "Are you Jessie Wang?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I just want you to know that she is going to Emmanuel College next year. And we would have never even knew that this was an option, that this was a school out there." And so that is how alumni impact it, right? Like, this is how we let students know that these colleges and universities that we are proud to represent are out there and a possibility for these students. So I'm very excited. This is obviously a student from East Tennessee, so it's going to be a completely different environment being in Boston for her. But I think it's going to be so fantastic. And so that is just an example of how this is one big circle of life, right? But what happens when we look at this through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens? What happens then is that we start asking ourselves questions. And I won't read all of this, but for example, with access, one of the questions that we can ask are our brochures only in English? And so if we're looking at Emmanuel, are the brochures that we're sending out with people only in English? Because what we know is that college going is really a family affair, especially for historically underrepresented populations. Specifically, if we're looking at the Hispanic Latinx population, we know that most of the time their parents play a key role in deciding where they're going to go to college. And if their parents can't read admissions material on Emmanuel College, then how are they even going to know that's an option for their student? So how are we increasing that access and awareness to the fact that Emmanuel College exists? And translating brochures into Spanish is one easy way that we can do that. Apply. So can low-income students afford the application? We know that students might know that Emmanuel College is out there, but can they afford the fee that goes along with the application? And if they can't, are there vouchers available, for example, for them? And these are questions we would ask at any college or university. I'm just using Emmanuel because obviously this is an Emmanuel College group. For admit and accept, can low-income students afford tuition, right? That's a question we should always be asking. But also, let's think about during tours, do students of color see other people who look like them on campus? And so what we hear often here is feedback from students saying, when I go onto a college campus, if I don't see students who look like me, I don't feel like this is a place for me. I don't feel like this is a place where I'm going to find community or belong. And so what we can do is we can look at our tour guides, for example. Do we have representation amongst the tour guides that are leading those tours? Are we making sure there's a diverse group of people there? For attend, do first generation students know what they have to do over summer? So I will tell you that one of the big barriers that we find is that there are certain immunizations you need to get before you go to a university or college. You would think that's not a big barrier, but it actually is. And I will say that right after I graduated from from Emmanuel, I went straight to Harvard for a graduate program. And as I had already filled out the application, I had already been accepted. I've realized that I did not have a tetanus shot that I needed to get in order, or some kind of painful shot that I needed to have in order to go there. And I literally turned around to my roommates at the time, all Emmanuel roommates, and I said, I'm not sure I really need to go to Harvard at this point because I have such a needle phobia. But But I am not a first generation student, and I did not know that that was something I needed to do. And so if I didn't know that, how do students who have parents who didn't go through the college process whatsoever, how do they know that they need to do that? Because I will tell you, surprisingly, students do not always read our emails. And so there could be information that they're missing. And so how do we make sure that information is more transparent to them too? When we talk about achieve, we're really talking about retention here. And that's what most of this presentation is going to focus on. But we're asking ourselves, are there supports in place for students of color to really help make them feel like they have a sense of belonging at an institution that is a predominantly white institution? And so predominantly white institution is really just defined as being an institution that has mostly white students. And so when we are most of the colleges and universities in the United States are predominantly white institutions. And when we're at an institution like this, how are we making sure students who don't identify that way find that sense of belonging? Other things that we can ask is, how can low-income students balance work and school? So here, I know many of our students work full-time while also balancing schoolwork. And we have to understand that's not something I could do. Like, I think I would be so exhausted. And so how are we also offering students grace when we know that they're balancing these multiple responsibilities? How are we supporting them through doing all of that too? And then alumni. So questions that we can ask there with a diversity, equity, inclusion lens are, what populations of alumni aren't engaged, right? If we break that up, just like we broke up our retention rates, if we break it up by gender, are male identifying students and female identifying students just as engaged, or is there a gap in between? Same thing with race and ethnicity. Are we going to find that sometimes some of our alumni who might identify as an alumni of color, are they as engaged as alumni who identify as white? And so figuring out where those kind of gaps are, and then let's think about how we can cross them and breach them. So when I was at Harvard, my research really focused on all the things we just talked about. So it focused on fostering historically underrepresented student success at predominantly white institutions of higher education. And I did this through an examination of the unique obstacles facing students of color and exploration on how to encourage student success by combating these challenges. And so this work really focused particularly on students who identified as a student of color. So we're talking about AAPI students, Asian American kind of students. We're talking about Black African American students, Hispanic Latinx students, specifically looking at those groups. So what are the barriers that we found? So from researching, I interviewed about 50 different students, all belonging to predominantly white institutions. And what we identified from that was that there were certain barriers that what they talked about could all be grouped into. And these barriers were a sense of isolation, so feeling like they didn't have community on campus or a sense of belonging. Absence of cultural competency at the institution. So feeling like that's basically saying they felt like they had to battle stereotypes, both inside and outside of classrooms, as well as feeling like there were microaggressions that they were really had to work against as well. Economic barriers were a big one. So sometimes students start off thinking that they are financially set. And then as tuition increases, or just as they come to terms with their financial situation, they realize that they can't possibly afford to continue on. Lack of mentors with similar ethnicities and backgrounds. And so that's really this idea of representation. So do you have faculty members in secondary schools? Do you have teachers that look like these students? Do we have teachers of color and faculty members of color? Lack of academic readiness. And this has nothing to do with the specific person and everything to do with the circumstances that they may have faced growing up. So we have to know that some students have access to SAT tutors and some students don't. Some students have access to better public schools and some students don't. And so this is this idea of certain populations face additional barriers and obstacles growing up in secondary schools than others do. And first generation. So many students of color also identify as first generation students themselves. And so this is an additional barrier that they then have to face, because what happens is that they might have very supportive parents, but they don't have parents who have gone through this exact process themselves. And so they may not be able to relate to them on certain challenges that they're facing. They may not be able to offer those supports exactly, and they may not even be aware of what those challenges are or what these students need to do in order to be successful. So how do we combat? Oh, let me touch on this really fast, and I won't read all of these, but just to help ground the conversation, these are some quotes from students of color at a predominantly white institution. So from the students that I met with. So one of them said, my first night at the college, a white student came up to me and started petting my braids in wonder. That experience was very shocking. And that was when I realized that I was in a place completely different from what I was used to. Another student said, it can oftentimes be overwhelming as a student of color to have to represent my entire culture in class discussions and racial incidents and beyond. And this was something many students of color shared with me, that oftentimes when they're in a classroom where there is not another student of color in there, or if there's only 2 or 3, that the professor can start talking about Africa and all the students turn around and look at the 1 or 2 Black students in the classroom. And that can make you feel very isolated, but it can also make you feel like you have to represent an entire culture in these discussions. There have been moments in classes where I would be taken aback by the lack of contextual understanding some students seem to have when talking about race in urban settings. And so this is language that students can use that can sometimes be inappropriate, harmful to others. And this is something many people talked about. It goes into this idea of cultural competency, which we'll talk a little bit more to. I still feel as if I'm helping my college meet a quota. My white peers will never know how it feels to be selected because of your skin color. And so this is the idea that many students of color can feel tokenized, so they can feel like they, or not even feel, they can be told sometimes even by other students that they are only here because of the color of their skin. And courses at my college did not represent or include me. So what can we do to combat these different areas, these different barriers that students are facing? What we developed was this idea of core goals. And so these are the acronyms that I love, but core goals stand for cultural competency, organized community, representation, and extra resources. And so if we dive into cultural competency, and again, I won't read all of these to you, but we'll make sure these slides are available if any of you are interested. Cultural competence is the ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures. So it encompasses being aware of your own worldview, but also developing positive attitudes towards cultural differences and other worldviews that other people might hold. So knowing that there's no one right way in a sense. So how can we do this in higher education settings and in secondary settings? Well, we can think about who we're including, what voices we're including in the classroom. So when we're in secondary school, we can think about, if we're learning about, figures in history, we can think about who we're learning about. If we're in higher education, what we can do is we can think about, let's look at the syllabus and let's look at all the assigned readings that are on the syllabus. And let's look at the authors of those readings. Are all of those authors white? If they are there voices that you're missing in this classroom because you're not hearing from people who identify in a different way? And so that is one very easy way to do it. And if you have a set of reading and they are all white authors, but you don't feel like you can change that, then what you could do is incorporate some sort of author analysis in the classroom. And so say, we understand that all of these authors identify as white, and this is something we did often in one of my Harvard classrooms that focused on the history of higher education. And we said, how do we think that this could affect their historical perspective? Would it be different if it was written by a Black author or a Hispanic Latinx author? So the idea of really creating that cultural competency by getting people to think outside of their own worldview and outside of their own perspective and embracing others. We're putting them in other people's shoes. Organized community is the idea of having purposefully created foundations to aid in community development and foster a sense of belonging on campus for underrepresented students. And when I talk about underrepresented students, we're really talking about students who are identified as a student of color or just not as commonly in history at these institutions of higher education. So what are some recommendations? Well, actually, Emmanuel College is really good at this with the student groups. So we have, at least when I was there was a Black student union, there is an Asian student association, a Muslim student association, and Huellas, which was our Latinx kind of group for Latina and Latino students. And so there are all these pockets that really bring students together so that they have that community. And the importance of that is that oftentimes students of color will say, in classrooms where I'm feeling like I'm the only person there, I feel like I have to code my language, or I feel like there's not that sense of belonging for me. And so how do we put them also into a community where they can see other people who have also gone through similar challenges as them, and they can really develop that sense of community there too. Multicultural centers are great places for this to happen as well. And there are other types of ideas too. Alumni of color committees, mentorship programs and funding is also a great way to do this. And I'll talk about that a little bit more too when I talk about representation next. So representation is the idea of having and seeing positive role models from the same racial and ethnic background. And so when we talk about secondary schools, for example, if we don't have teachers who identify as a person of color, then is there teacher aides that we can hire that might identify as a person of color? How are we making sure that in these classrooms, students are seeing representation and seeing positive role models of people that look like them? In higher education, are our faculty and staff diverse? If they're not, how are we making sure that we do incorporate some of that diversity too? So we can be purposeful in some of our hiring processes, but beyond that, we can also think about what pockets we do have that we can call on. And oftentimes that can be our alumni of color. And so are we incorporating an alumni of color group, for example, that could possibly mentor undergraduate students that also identify as a student of color? So can we create these foundations of support here too, so that we have these possibilities, so that we can match up these students and give them that representation, so that even if we're not seeing it directly in our student body right now, even if we're not seeing it in our faculty and staff, we can also think beyond that too. There's also different possibilities, and I'll talk about them a little bit more later on too, of mentoring groups with students, like a student-to-student mentoring group, and of course, faculty and staff of color mentoring programs where they can also act as mentors towards our students of color. Extra resources. So having the necessary additional resources to support students coming from diverse racial, socioeconomic, and educational backgrounds. So what are resources that we should have in place to support student success? Oftentimes that's peer-to-peer tutoring, which I know that Emmanuel College has and has had great success with. One that we actually don't think about too often is explaining the purpose of office hours. And so specifically for first generation students, you come in, you sit down in a class, and on the first day of class, you receive the syllabus and your professor tells you, these are my office hours, come visit me during them, something like that. Or sometimes they don't even say the come visit me part. They'll just say my office hours are Tuesday and Thursday from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. What happens is that for a first generation student, many students actually don't realize what office hours are until months, if not years, into their time in a college or university. They think office hours are times where professors are sitting in their office and you shouldn't interrupt them because they're getting work done. And that's their office hour. And so I actually talked to many students who held this belief and didn't realize exactly what they were until much later. And so let's explain the purpose of office hours on that first day of school. This is a time where you can come see me if you're having problems in class, if you want to review a test grade that you received or the grade you received on a paper. So it's little ways, takes 2 minutes to do, but it could really help the student understand resources that are out there for them. The counseling center is such a great resource. What we're seeing, especially now they're in this place where COVID is still out there, but hopefully the worst is behind us. We are seeing a complete mental health crisis in higher education and in secondary schools. And so how are we making sure that students are getting the resources that they need to be successful? These are students that literally through the most foundational years of their life were in a global pandemic, removed from society, isolated, and not getting that in-person education. And so they're going through particular challenges that other generations have not gone through. And so how are we meeting the needs that they might have that are unique to this generation? And many of these needs are actually taking the form of mental health needs. And so I know Emmanuel College has a great counseling center. How are we making sure students know that's a resource out there for them? How are we getting them into these classes, into the counseling center? And more importantly, when we think about cultural differences, we also know that different cultures approach mental health in different ways. For example, in the Asian community, there is a bit of a stigma still with mental health. And so oftentimes, instead of saying I have, anxiety, you might say my stomach hurts. It might take the form of physical symptoms that you identify before you are able to identify what's really the root problem. And so this idea of how are we breaking down those barriers to make sure that students coming from different cultural backgrounds are having access and knowing that this is an okay resource to use. It's a great resource to use, and that can really help them academically as well. And so when I say that, we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so this is something probably many of you saw in your own undergraduate years, but it's this idea that in order to obtain self-actualization, which is this idea of you are as content as you can be, you feel like you have contributed as much as you can to the world, you're in this really great place, right? How do we get there? And there's different things we have to do. But if we think about this, if we think about self-actualization as degree attainment and students graduating, feeling like they are prepared to enter the world, feeling like they had a great experience at Emmanuel College, these things still need to happen in order for them to get there. And so what is that? Well, physiological needs. So are students struggling with food insecurity? Are they struggling with homelessness, working at night, or students with young children of their own? Because if they are, these are all things that can affect their physiological needs, which then affect them being able to achieve all of these other things. So it's this pyramid that we work up. And this is this idea that we were just talking about the extra resources. How are we putting resources in place to stop these things? And so I know a few years ago when I was there, Emmanuel College had a Swipe It Forward program in the dining hall or cafeteria. I'm not sure if they still do, but that is a great way to help with some students who might be facing some sort of food insecurity. So if they can't afford a meal plan, for example, they're living off campus and they can't afford a meal plan, do we have something like a Swipe It Forward program where students can donate meal swipes to students in need? Safety needs. So do students feel like they're living in safe environments? We have students living all around Boston. Some neighborhoods of Boston are safer than others. If students are feeling unsafe, then they might not be getting that sleep that they need. They might not be being able to be set up for success that way too. Students who lost their job. If students were relying on a steady income from a job and then face a situation where they lost it, that can affect them being able to pay for tuition, for example, pay for that meal plan. Students who have been cut off from family, students who have COVID or are sick, these are all safety needs that can affect them being able to be successful academically. When it comes to love and belonging, we have this idea of students who might feel outcasted, and many of our students of color do feel like they are outcasted. They don't feel like they have that sense of community. They don't see others who look like them. A lot of students that I work with here who come out as LGBTQ plus students, they have faced some sort of rejection from their family. And again, I'm in Tennessee, and so we see this a lot more commonly probably here. And so these are students that are, they have come out during college, they are all of a sudden facing this rejection, and this is really affecting them being able, of course, to be successful academically, to show up to classes, to be able to focus on homework. And so thinking about all of these needs that can impact student success. And lastly, esteem. So this can be students who struggle with imposter syndrome, this idea that we feel like we're just waiting for people to find out that we don't actually belong here, that we're not as smart as we try to be or come across as, or maybe we just don't feel smart at all. We look around and we say, how am I here? I don't belong here. Students who feel like they're tokenized. And so we talked about that earlier, students of color who might feel like they are only here because they meet some sort of diversity quota, which is things that many people can oftentimes tell them that are very harmful to self-esteem. And students who feel silenced in class. So maybe students who have diverse perspectives that they've shared and feel like they have not been seen or heard in the classroom. So feel like they have been met with some sort of wall in it and now feel silenced. They're questioning if they should be here. They're not having that self-esteem to speak up again. They're not feeling respected. And so that is all different things that can impact this idea of getting towards that area of student success. So what are we doing to combat these? These are just some ideas, and I thought it'd be helpful actually to share ideas that we've actually done because they might be helpful just to frame of what are some ideas out there. So when I started here, I really wanted to think of a program that we could have that would impact all 4 of these core goals: cultural competency, organized community, representation, and extra resources. And what we came up with was the STRIVE program. It stands for Students Teaching and Representing Inclusive Values and Excellence. And it's a student of color mentoring initiative. So sophomore, junior, and senior students of color opt into the program to be a mentor to an incoming freshman student of color. And throughout the year, they meet at different places. They offer them mentorship and guidance. But more than that, throughout this whole group, we have a whole bunch of dialogues on diversity, equity, inclusion. And so these dialogues can include things like how to take up space in a predominantly white classroom. So how to share your voice in a classroom and feel confident in that, how to recognize and respond to microaggressions. So if someone does say something to you that you say, this is a microaggression, how are you able to have that conversation with them and make it a teachable moment? That question of, what do you mean by that? And let's talk about it a little bit more. Inclusive language, implicit bias, so many more. What makes this program unique is that what we do at the end of the year is we actually flip the table of teacher and learner. And so what we do is we have students get into groups and they pick a topic on diversity, equity, and inclusion that they want to present on, and then they create their own presentation to talk about that topic. And so, for example, students might do one on understanding and unlearning implicit bias. And then what they're going to do is they offer a presentation to our community. And so our faculty members, our teachers can go into those classrooms as well as students and learn from the student. And it means so much more coming from that student than it does coming from someone like me who's in an administrative position. So it reverses the role of students and faculty. Right now, we have students who are training faculty. And so that is kind of one of the things that we have found that's really unique to this program, and what we found great success with, in the sense of people are really, really excited about being able to hear from students directly. Another program that we've developed is geared towards first generation students. And so that taps into organized community representation and extra resources. And what we did is we asked our faculty and staff here who identifies as a first generation college student themselves. And if they did identify, we asked, would you be open to mentoring a freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior, so any undergraduate student that identifies as first generation. And then if they opt into this program, they're paired with that mentor who's a faculty or staff member, and it allows them to have this informal relationship with that mentor. They meet over, a cup of coffee at Starbucks, for example. So we put them in a neutral territory where they can ask questions. They can see someone who is in the same position as themselves that's now successful. So they see that representation, and they can also have those conversations and break down barriers of this idea that faculty and staff are really intimidating or not accessible, or I don't feel like I can have these conversations with them. We also developed a Real Talks program that came out of this. So this goes under this category, and it's really meant to break down the hidden curriculum of higher ed. And we define the hidden curriculum as things that we can sometimes assume students know, but they really don't, and especially first generation students. So some of the Real Talk programs we've had is pause and resume/resume. You get it? Like, it's a play on words. Time to edit your resume. We have WTF, what the FAFSA. We have a Networking 101 program, which we have found a lot of students don't understand how to network necessarily. And that is a skill that is so important in today's age, especially later on as you're looking for jobs. And this is a skill they will use for the rest of their life. So we can't just assume people know how to network. Let's actually have a workshop on it. Ain't nobody got time for that. A time management workshop you probably don't have time for. We have one on job interview tips, cover letters. Here we go again, applying to grad school, because if students don't know how to apply to undergraduate, they definitely don't know how to apply to graduate school. These are students who are first generation students. So how do we make that process easier and more transparent for them? It's not always common sense. You get it? Common sense, personal finances. So really talking about in college, you are going to have financial control over things that you might not have had before, and also financial responsibility. Do you know how to budget for groceries? Do you know how to budget when all your friends are going out and maybe you can't afford that lifestyle? And so having some of these hard conversations about personal finances too, because many times this might not be a skill set they have. And then you are enough, overcoming imposter syndrome. And so really talking about improving that self-efficacy, making sure students feel like they belong here too. So those are just some of the programs that we have out of this, but that we have really found helpful. And I will tell you that when we put a fun name with things, students are more likely to come. So this also helps too. And we have different people from around our campus lead them. I've led a few of them, but we'll find particular people with talents in these areas. Sometimes it's an alumni, sometimes it's a faculty or staff member, sometimes it's a department, but someone will lead this, and that has really helped. I won't talk about this one that much, but we also have a diversity, equity, inclusion advisory council for our college. And so this is a group, and I'm pretty sure Emmanuel College has something very similar to this, of faculty and staff members that really help us push along our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So really represent, this is what I'm hearing students say, this is what I'm hearing faculty or staff of color say, these are supports that we need. And it really helps us enable multiple perspectives to be shared. Out of this council, we have had several different recommendations. Again, I won't read all these to you, but these are some of the different things that we're working on. So one of the things is that we said, we also need a student advisory committee. And so let's create a student advisory committee on diversity, equity, and inclusion that will report to our dean or to our president and share the student perspective of what it is like to be a student of color, or be a student with a disability, or be a first generation student, or be an LGBTQ plus student on our campus. And so representing a wide range of diversity, we bring these students together to talk about how the college supports them. Are there areas that we could do that would be better? How can we improve? What do we do well? Really having these conversations. What are challenges that they might be facing? These are just different things that we will send out to talk about. Sometimes we'll send these out to faculty and staff members. I'll focus on one, for example, when we transitioned because of COVID, all of a sudden to online learning. What we didn't think about were some of the inequities there. And so we had students who didn't have their own laptop at home. So how are they going to be joining us on online classes? So can we make sure that we have a laptop library where students who can't afford a laptop could check out one from us for the semester? Beyond that, some students didn't even have access to Wi-Fi. And so if they don't have access to Wi-Fi, it doesn't matter if they have a laptop or not, they still weren't able to log on to that Zoom. So then we started checking out personal hotspots as well. And so students who demonstrated having financial need, we were able to say, yes, you're eligible for this. And we checked about a hotspot to them for the semester. Another one was noise canceling headphones. And this is important for students who might be living in families where they're multi-generational households. So families that might have your grandparents living with you, as well as your parents, as well as children. And so all of a sudden you're in a much louder environment. It's hard to focus. You're being disturbed during classes. And so let's think about a resource that could be available there. Same thing with some of our students actually have young children themselves. And so now you're at home with your young children. This is during COVID, so you can't send them to daycare. These noise canceling headphones definitely came in handy. Web cameras, we checked out web cameras because not all laptops have a web camera. And many of our, faculty members really wanted students to turn on those Zoom cameras in the beginning too. And so making sure we check those out. And then we even had some printers that students could check out as well for students who needed something like that. So just thinking about those additional resources, what are things that we're assuming students have, but they might not actually have access to? We talk about how to make email more inclusive and engaging. And so oftentimes that includes uploading a picture of yourself, including pronouns in emails in order to make students who might identify in that LGBTQ plus population feel like they can also share their own pronouns. And then even adding social media or something else to your social media signature, to your email signature too, that just makes you have more personal touch. Social media, I'm not talking about your own private Facebooks. I'm talking about if you have a college wide social media, just to be clear. I do not link my personal social media to this, but for example, we have one for our Office of Student Success, and I will link that there. And that's also where our students can find information that I might need them to find. So this is just other ideas of how we can support equitable student success virtually. So kind of wrapping this up, just starting with some basics. So these are questions you can ask yourself. Have you defined what office hours are, both in person, but also on your syllabus? Are you looking at the authors of books on a syllabus and saying, are they all white? Is there representation amongst them? How could a person or author's race impact their perspective? Using pronouns in your syllabus, on email, on Zoom, etc. When you're requiring internships in your major curriculum, right? Many of our majors require some sort of internship. Are we helping low-income students find paid internships? Because we know that there's both. There's internships you have to do for free and there's paid ones. Well, for students who have to work, this internship might be taking them away from their workplace. And so are they at least earning money this way too? So let's work with these students particularly to say, let's help you find an internship that is paid. And do students who aren't doing well in classes have the technology resources they need? And so this is what we talked about earlier: laptops, hotspots, noise canceling headphones, etc. So in conclusion, it really is an all-in effort. My kind of motto throughout this work is faster alone, further together, right? In order to make strides so that the next generation does not face the same challenges that this generation and past generations have faced, we really need to come together in this work. And so it's all about bridging those divides, bringing people together, figuring out and acknowledging what gaps may exist, and then figuring out how can we break down those gaps in order to create a process where all students feel supported, have equal opportunity and access, and are able to ultimately get across that graduation stage and be successful in whatever career or graduate school that they end up deciding to go to next. So thank you. I'm sorry I talked so fast. I was trying to be aware of time. I did include my contact information in here as well. If anybody would like to follow up on anything, I'm happy to do that. And so my email, my phone number, and my LinkedIn are all on here. But I so appreciate you all taking the time to be here today and join me in this conversation. And I just appreciate that you all, I'm sure, are championing some of this work yourselves. And it is so needed in today's age. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jessie. I love your signature line. No matter where you're from, we're glad you're here. Thank you so much. We'll give everybody a second to take a look at that. Write down in your email and things like that. And then now we'll open it up for discussion. Who has a question? That was a lot of good stuff. Thank you, Jessie. I think that Mary Beth Thomas just put a comment, and then I'll call on you, Anu. Thank you. Feel free to unmute. Mary Beth Thomas just put a note saying that they actually just changed it from office hours to student hours here at Emmanuel. So that's actually a really good step in the right direction. So, yeah, Anu, feel free to unmute.
Hi, thank you so much. This was an amazing talk. I actually met you at one of Sister Janet's parties.
Yes,
Just
was it
very briefly, but
last April, maybe it was.
yes,
Or
yeah,
May. Yeah, it's nice to see
yeah.
you.
Yeah, so it was nice to see you. And yeah, this was amazing. I'm just so blown away by how much you've accomplished and how much you've done in a very short amount of time. And so, yeah, my comment is that, I think you have so many amazing things going, and I think that it seems like you have a good team there, that people are engaged, and that you were hired as part of this initiative, that they recognized they needed to make these changes and hired you. And so I have, I guess, two questions. One question is just, you have all these great programs. How do you get students to show up? Because I think that there are a lot of programs that we're always trying to do, and it's a lot. Students have a lot going on, and they miss one email, and then they're not in the peer mentoring program. And like, how do you manage this issue?
Yeah, so a lot of times we realize that students are not obviously responding to our emails. There are definitely students that we're missing. And so part of our conversation is always, how are we making sure that students who are sitting in the back of the classroom that maybe aren't speaking up in class, how are we reaching those students too? Not just the students that are sitting in the front row that are already active at their college university. And so one of the things we did is we actually transitioned a lot of the important information we share to a social media platform. And it sounds silly, but what we found was that students are not checking their email, but what they are checking is their Instagram. And so how are we present on there too? And so we actually commit a lot of time to our own social media. We have a student success engagement page, and we actually do reels, like the little TikTok videos, but we do them about things like, did you know the FAFSA deadline is coming up and you need to get that in? Or the scholarship deadline is coming up, and here are the things that you need to have ready in order to fill out that application. And so little videos, but that are interactive and share important information, and that we know that they are much more likely to watch that than they are to read through an email. So how do we cater information to this generation? And we know that Gen Z is really active on these online platforms. And so reaching them there. The other thing that we did is we pulled our faculty into it too. And we said, hey, could you advertise this in your class at the end of your class period, especially if faculty taught a subject matter that was close to a topic that we were talking about. And so, for example, if we're talking about our first generation program that talks about personal finances, we would go to our accounting professors and our professors that were in some of these courses and say, our business courses, hey, can you advertise that we have this talk coming up? And it's really for this program, but it's open to any student who wants to attend attended. We have a Black American Studies program here. And so we went to them and we said, hey, can you advertise Strive to your students? So that's student of color mentoring program. So we really think about who are also the people that are in front of those students all the time. And oftentimes that's our faculty. Those are the people that students trust too, because they're working with them several times a week. They're seeing them, they're active with them already. And so really making sure that they're targeting the students. We also different things. We had issues in the beginning of getting students to sign up, especially for our Strive program. And so we reached out to faculty and we said, can you nominate a few students? And then are you comfortable with us sharing that you nominate them? And once we sent emails that said, you've been nominated for this program by this faculty member, all of a sudden they were like, oh, this is really interesting. This person that I trust thinks that this would be a really great program and leadership opportunity for me. And so that also helped facilitate it a bit too.
Awesome. I have one more question, then I'll stop hogging you. I am going to reach out to you because I noticed that your research and your graduate program was to an video interview project. And that's something that I'm doing here with some students in STEM specifically. So we're kind of focused on students' experience in STEM and specifically Black students in STEM. And so one of the themes that you mentioned, we've seen a lot of similar themes, but one of the themes you mentioned was this lack of academic readiness. And I think that that's so tricky because the student is feeling they're not academically ready because the environment is telling them they're not academically ready. So it's more of this kind of deficit mindset that students are being forced to see themselves as less than their peers. So I wonder your thoughts about that and how you're tackling that at your institution.
Yeah, so this also goes into that self-efficacy work, right? So like, how are we making sure that students also sometimes they're undermining their own skill set, like they're underselling themselves. But if they are coming in and they're not maybe at the same academic level as some of their other students, how are we making sure we get them there? But how are we also making sure that we know we're all lifelong learners, right? Like you're literally here to grow and to learn academically. So we're not expecting you to come in knowing it all. That's what college is for. It's for figuring it out. And so really trying to change that mindset around not thinking about just this deficit mindset of what don't I have, but what can I contribute, right? So when I'm working with students of color, yes, maybe you don't feel like you know math, for example, as well as some of your peers do, but what can you contribute? When you're sitting in a classroom, have you had experiences in your own life that you can contribute to some of these conversations? So when we're having conversations about history or about critical thinking, do we have our own experiences that we went through that we can contribute? Same thing with this idea of resiliency, right? We know that so many students of color have gone through particular struggles or challenges that they've had to overcome. And so maybe they're not as academically ready as some other students, but are they more resilient? Do they have this opportunity to overcome better? And have they had more experiences where they've had to overcome challenges? That could be the case too. And so thinking about, let's not talk about just what you don't have. Let's talk about what you do have. So tell me more about you. What have you had to do in your life? What experiences have you had? So we have those conversations as well and really flip that table to make them start thinking more positively too. It's this idea of let's acknowledge our strengths, not just our areas of growth. Sorry, Ellen.
Beautiful. No, you're good. You're good.
I know. I'm like,
I feel like we could talk about this all day, and I would actually love that because it's such valuable information that you're sharing. I just in an effort to, just kind of wrap things up and everything. I mean, honestly, this is fascinating stuff, and I think we should actually have you back again to present part 2 because I feel like we could talk about this all day. But I just put some links to some upcoming events in the chat. Super brief. Feel free to check out the alumni website. We always are posting new events, including the last 3 installments of our Alumni Spotlight Series that we're so grateful, Jessie, for your time and your sharing your talent today. This clearly is a passion of yours, and we're so grateful to be just receiving your wisdom and your experiences. So feel free to check out the alumni website. We have a couple of events coming up that all alumni are invited to. All alumni are invited to all events. The inauguration of Emmanuel's new president, Dr. Boyd, will take place on Friday, April 14th. We have the 10th annual Dorothy Day lecture coming up on Sunday, April 23rd, featuring Amy Goodman. We have our next 3 alumni spotlight speakers scheduled for April 26th, May 24th, and June 21st. All those registration links are on the website. And last but not least, we have Alumni Weekend coming up June 2nd through the 4th. In addition to special events for class years ending in 3 and 8, we'll be offering a number of all alumni events. Everyone is welcome, invited to everything. If you ever have a question about an alumni event, feel free to reach out to us here, either Alexis or myself in the alumni office, and we are happy to answer those questions. We probably have time for like a 30-second comment or question if anybody wants to take that. Otherwise, we can let people go and just send all our best wishes for a really good afternoon. Thank you so much, Jessie Wang. You're a favorite, and and we're so blessed to receive your wisdom. Thank you so much. Yeah, follow up with Jessie or with us if you have any additional questions. And thank you everybody for joining us today.
Great to
Take care.
see you, Jessie.
Good to see you all.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you, Joanne. Thank you. Good to see you again.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I'm going to end the meeting now, but please feel free to follow up if you need to. Thanks for coming.
Bye all. Good to see
Bye,
you.
Jessie.